The wind had not slept all night. It howled through the acacia trees with the low moan of something ancient, dragging clouds heavy with rain across the early morning sky. The horizon glowed faintly with the first hints of dawn, not golden, but steel gray, smeared with shadows. And then it came. A roar, but not the kind tourists waited for. Not the deep, rolling call that claimed territory or summoned pride members. This was different. It was longer, rougher, and it came again and again, each time closer to the old dam. In Ranger Post 9, nestled on the eastern ridge, Nico sat up straight in his chair. The roar vibrated through the windows, even through the storm-dampened air. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing. That's not his usual pattern, he muttered, flicking through the audio logs on the terminal. Nico had been monitoring lion activity in the park for 2 years. He knew MK9, the dominant male of the Broken Valley territory, by sound alone. His patterns were regular, territorial, efficient. But this? It sounded like a warning. Out on the field, Ranger Salima was already pushing her jeep through the mud-packed road that snaked toward the dam. The rain hadn't let up in days, and the lowlands were slick with runoff. Normally, lions kept to the western ridges during storms. Drier ground, better visibility. Yet MK9 had crossed the marsh line hours earlier, moving alone, fast. He's circling the dam basin, Salima radioed in, not stalking, just pacing. Rumbling? Nico asked. More than that. He's roaring. At the concrete, the dam loomed up ahead, a squat structure of aging stone and rebar, its main spillway bulging under the pressure of days of unrelenting rain. It had been patched years ago, one of those temporary fixes that outlived the original engineers. Salima cut the engine and stepped out. And there he was. MK9, perched on a rocky rise just meters from the dam's sidewall. His mane was soaked, clinging to his muscled shoulders. Water dripped from his muzzle. And still, he roared, not at prey, not at intruders, at the wall. Salima stood frozen. The lion wasn't charging. He wasn't even posturing. He was pacing in tight circles, his claws scraping at the mud, tail twitching low. Every few seconds he stopped, lowered his head, and stared at the same patch of concrete, then let loose another thunderous, throat-tearing roar. It was a sound no ranger had heard before, a sound that vibrated with something more than power. It vibrated with urgency. Back at Post 9, Nico frowned. He scanned the dam sensors. Nothing out of spec, no seismic alarms, no visible breach. Still, he said, "Wake up the supervisor." "And call engineering." "Why?" the junior ranger asked. Nico didn't blink. "Because the lion knows something's coming. And if we're wrong, we've got a dam full of water, ready to teach us what we missed." By 6:17 a.m., the rain had shifted from steady to slashing. The storm rolled over the hills in bands, veiling the terrain in sheets of gray. The dawn light never fully arrived, only a pale suggestion of morning. Ranger Salima waited near the dam's southern access gate, engine idling, windshield wipers dragging against the flood of water. MK9 had retreated to a rock outcrop a short distance away. He no longer roared, but his tail lashed restlessly, his eyes locked on the dam's bulk. He was still watching. The inspection crew arrived with 3 trucks, 2 civil engineers, a junior hydrologist, and a technician from the Ministry of Infrastructure. They were all tired, unprepared, and skeptical. "A lion's behavior isn't a trigger for emergency protocol," one of them said to Nico over the radio. "Neither is waiting for a dam to split open," Nico snapped back. He had been staring at sensor data for over 2 hours. Pressure readings were elevated, but not critical. Flow rates downstream were up, but still within range. But what he couldn't ignore was a small anomaly on the northern support data line, a delay in the sensor's ping response. "That's not water pressure," he muttered. "That's latency." A few seconds off, but that was enough. Enough to mean something inside the wall was shifting. The inspectors trudged to the spillway under heavy slickers. Salima walked with them, boots sinking into the soaked clay. "We need to check the northeastern base," she told them. That's where the lion was focusing. "We'll start at the primary sluice," said the lead engineer. "Standard procedure." Salima looked back at MK9. He stood, ears turned forward, muscles tight. He did not follow the humans. Instead, he padded toward the far end of the dam, pacing a tight half circle near the waterline. His paws struck a low stone shelf that trembled underfoot. That's when Salima felt it. A subtle, low vibration. Not like thunder, not like wind, but like something hollow moving beneath her boots. At 7:11 a.m., the technician on the ridge called in. "We've got seepage." "Repeat that," Nico said. "Seepage at the northeastern abutment." Faint flow from beneath the concrete. It's not runoff water, was coming from inside the wall. MK9 stood just meters from that very point, eyes locked on the ground, his mane flattened by rain and wind. And then he roared again. This time, not as a cry, but as if he were calling out the truth. Back at the ranger station, emergency lights flickered on. Red, silent, waiting. Nico picked up the radio and made the call no one wanted to hear. "This is Post 9. Initiate evacuation protocol for lowland zones. All units to high ground." The lion turned, stepped slowly up the ridge, and disappeared into the brush. Behind him, the dam groaned, a long, low moan, like the breath of something ancient, exhaling for the first time in decades. It was beginning. The rain was no longer falling. It was slamming the land. By 8 a.m., the hill roads were rivers. Radios crackled with static and broken voices as rangers tried to coordinate from scattered posts. Trees swayed dangerously, and herds that had taken shelter began to move, sensing something coming from below the surface of things. Nature was shifting, and the lion was gone. MK9 had vanished into the ridgeline above the dam after his final roar. No fresh tracks in the mud, no eyes caught in the headlights. But those who had seen him that morning couldn't forget the intensity of his gaze. Fixed, immovable, warning. Ranger Salima stayed near the dam, perched on the passenger seat of a stalled Jeep. Steam hissed from the engine. Her boots were soaked through, her fingers trembling. The inspection team had split. The engineer and technician were climbing the back trail toward higher ground, carrying the dam logbook and emergency kit. The others had gone down to place a seismic marker near the abutment. They never got that far. Because at 8:14 a.m., the dam spoke. It began with a crack, sharp, brittle, like snapping bone, followed by an echoing rumble deep inside the stone. Then, silence. Salima stood frozen. Then came the sound of air being pulled, as if the mountain was inhaling, drawing all breath and noise into a single space. And then, it exhaled. A roar, deeper than thunder, longer than any lion could dream of. The groan of collapsing time and pressure. The crack had spread. In the command tent upbridge, Nico stood over the terminal. The water pressure graph spiked off the chart. Alarms blared, then cut out. "Evacuate everything south of the valley," he ordered. His voice was steady. His chest was not. On his monitor, a live drone feed stuttered, pixelated, then reloaded. And in that single clear frame, Nico saw it. The entire eastern wall of the dam had started to bow. Hairline cracks webbed across the surface like veins. And standing atop the overlook, almost motionless, was the lion. MK9 didn't move, didn't pace, didn't roar. He simply stared at the structure below, as if watching a giant fall to its knees. Downstream animals were already on the move. Baboons shrieked from treetops, warthogs charged blindly through wet brush, and a herd of elephants turned away from their usual crossing point, trumpeting with frantic instinct. Only humans still needed proof. But proof had arrived, and it was screaming in the stone. The skies above the valley had darkened into near night, though the clock had just turned 9 a.m. The sun was nowhere, buried behind angry walls of storm cloud. Thunder walked across the ridges like a god testing the ground, and the dam groaned. Each vibration now felt like it traveled through the bone. The wall didn't just crack. It spoke in shudders and stutters, in the sound of splitting cement and twisting steel. The inspection crew had retreated, but they were too late. Salima, soaked to the skin and shivering from more than cold, radioed in from the base of the southern wall. The fissures have opened. Main sluice gate is holding, but the side abutment is flexing. Evacuate now, Nico ordered. Full pullback. All rangers out of Zone 3 and 4. From the ridge tent, Nico watched the feed blink again. When it returned, a long vertical line had appeared across the dam's eastern face. A crack. Clear. Spanning 5 meters. And growing. Down below, the river basin rumbled beneath the soil. The dam had stood for 48 years. It had been patched and repoured and sealed. But it was never meant to carry this much rain. The storm had broken records 3 days running. The earth itself was waterlogged, and now the concrete that held it all back was beginning to float on its own foundation. One more push, one more breath, and it would go. And still, the lion watched. From a shadowed rise above the basin, MK9 stood like a statue carved of gold and ash, rain streaming from his mane. His eyes tracked the cracking wall, then darted south toward the old herding trails, where hundreds of animals moved instinctively for higher ground. He's guiding them, Salima whispered, watching through binoculars. She saw him leap down the slope once, disappearing into brush, then reappear farther down, just ahead of a group of antelope frozen in the storm. He didn't lunge, didn't stalk. He led. And when they turned, following his pace, he roared once more, loud, sharp, and filled with the tension of a cliff about to give. The first piece of the dam fell at 9:36 a.m. Not the wall itself, but a concrete anchor near the eastern sluice gate. A slab 3 meters wide detached and dropped into the runoff channel, vanishing in a spray of white water and mist. The ground shook. Sirens in the ranger station screamed to life. All alerts went red. "This is it," Nico said. "It's going." And behind him, far down the valley, a child's voice cried out from a tented shelter, "The lion is roaring again." But this time, it wasn't just a roar. It was a signal, a closing chapter, the final breath before collapse. It began with a sound no one could name. Not thunder, not explosion, not rockfall or landslide. It was all of them combined, and something worse. A deep, guttural ripping sound, like the earth's very spine being torn out, a noise that froze the air itself. The dam wall had fractured. Not a partial collapse, not a corner. The entire eastern face buckled forward. One crack split into dozens, racing across the concrete like veins of lightning. Then, the pressure gave way, and the wall shattered. At 9:41 a.m., the Broken Valley Dam burst open. A tidal wall of water, millions of gallons, surged forward, dragging twisted steel and jagged rock in its path. The sound was deafening. The trees that lined the valley floor bent backward before the water even reached them, shredded by sheer force of displaced air. The flood didn't flow. It charged. From her post on the lower ridge, Salima ran. She didn't look back. The sound behind her told her all she needed to know. Her jeep was lost. Half submerged in the mud, now turned to torrent. She tossed her radio onto higher rock and climbed as the valley floor vanished beneath roiling brown chaos. Animals, hundreds, fled with her. Baboons scrambled up acacia trees. Gazelle bounded through shallow bush trails. Birds screamed skyward in tangled flocks. Even elephants, majestic and wide, moved like ghosts, sensing the speed of death behind them. And somewhere in the floodplain, a lion ran too. From the ranger command post on the upper hill, Nico watched the drone feed as the wall vanished. He didn't curse, didn't shout. He just whispered, "He knew. He knew before we did." The wave hit the first animal shelter at 9:47 a.m. But no lives were lost, because every shelter had been emptied. Every ranger post had been pulled, and the herds had already been moving uphill, led not by sirens, but by instinct. On the slope above the floodline, MK9 emerged, soaked, slick with mud, but unhurt. His mane was wild, flared like a crown in the rising wind. He stood still as the valley below screamed in water. He didn't roar. He watched. And in his silence was the memory of everything that almost wasn't saved. By 11:30 a.m., the rain had stopped. The wind still whispered along the broken ridges, but the sky above the valley was quiet, painted in bruised blues and silvers. Steam lifted from the shattered basin where the dam had once stood, and the floodwaters now moved in slow, bloated spirals, carrying debris and broken trees through drowned fields. The disaster had passed, but what it left behind was silence. From the air, the valley looked wounded. The river had torn through its center like a scar. Roads were gone, huts smashed, ranger trails vanished beneath the silt. What stood tall this morning now leaned or had been erased. But also from the air, something unexpected was seen. A trail, winding, unmistakable, pressed into the higher clay ridges, paw prints, large, singular, a lion's, and beside them, hoof prints, hundreds of them. Ranger Salima, wrapped in a thermal blanket and bruised across one shoulder, stood on a high overlook. Her breath steamed as she stared down the valley. Around her, a rescue team moved into position, checking for survivors, marking safe paths, salvaging equipment. They didn't just run, she said softly to the technician beside her. They followed him. The man looked at her. The lion? She nodded. He ran ahead of them, cut off their usual grazing paths, moved like a shepherd, not like a predator. Back in the operations tent, Nico scanned over drone footage and ground data. Hydrologists were still calculating what went wrong, how the sensors missed the warning signs. But the conclusion was the same across all teams. The lion's behavior was the first alert. The only one that came early enough. One drone had captured it all. MK9 roaring, pacing, retreating, returning, always staying close to the dam's weak flank. Always alert. Always speaking in the only language he had. And now, his prints marked the escape route, followed by hundreds of lives, animal and human alike. By nightfall, temporary shelters were up. No lives had been lost. A miracle, they called it. But those who had been there, who had heard that early roar in the wind, knew better. It wasn't a miracle. It was a message, delivered by an ancient voice beneath the storm. And just before the last ranger left the overlook, they saw him again. MK9, atop the opposite hill, his mane blowing in the wind, his eyes on the floodplain below, still watching, still listening, still protecting. 3 weeks later, the valley was still healing. Where water had raged, now only mud remained. Thick, dark, scarred with tree trunks and shattered concrete. The dam was gone. Plans for a new one were being drafted, with better materials, deeper foundations, modern sensors. But for those who'd lived through that morning, no blueprints could replace what had been lost, nor explain what had been understood too late. MK9 had not been seen since the storm broke. No rangers had tracked him. No trail cameras had caught him. The lion who had saved the valley had vanished, like a ghost returning to myth. Some said he had returned to his pride deeper in the reserve. Others whispered he had gone, where no storm could reach him. But no one forgot. The evacuation report listed 0 casualties, an impossibility, a miracle. But alongside the engineering notes, the rainfall data, and drone images, one report stood out. Unusual behavioral patterns observed in MK9. Vocalizations occurred between 4 a.m. and 7 a.m., directed toward weakened dam wall. Pattern persisted until structural failure. Based on ranger accounts, animal behavior directly influenced timing of evacuation orders. Conclusion: early warning system. Biological, not technological. And so, the legend began. Children in the surrounding villages began to draw lions with open mouths and storm clouds behind them. Tourists arriving months later would ask, not about the disaster, but about the lion who warned the rangers. A mural was painted across the new ranger station wall, MK9 standing on the rise above the broken dam, his mouth open in a silent roar, the sky cracking with lightning behind him. No plaque, no title, just the name whispered now in every corner of the reserve, the Silent King. And then one day, early before dawn, with the mist still on the grass, Selima heard a sound across the valley. Not thunder, not wind, but something deep, low, and familiar. A single drawn-out roar, far off from the western hills, and she smiled. Because some kings don't need crowns. They only need to be heard.